Have you ever supported a local mixed-use development or a nearby complete streets project and wondered, how can I actually invest in these community projects? And I'm not talking about tax dollars. I mean getting a real stake in the project. A slice of the pie usually reserved for private equity firms, developers, and institutional investors. This week's episode dives into equity crowdfunding, a movement that allows everyday people, like you and me, to put money into community projects and see financial returns. Nearly a decade ago, Brian Ross founded InfraShares, recognizing a gap in infrastructure funding and leveraging new laws to create an online platform for equity crowdfunding. His vision? Give communities direct ownership in the projects shaping their cities. Today, we'll explore how equity crowdfunding is reshaping infrastructure finance and how this approach is already in action in helping communities take financial and social ownership of the places they live. I'm Kate Gasparro, and this is Building Better Cities. You have a background in transaction advisory, and you've worked in infrastructure finance and project development for your entire career. Even when you were with the military, you were working for infrastructure?
Well, construction.
Construction.
Yeah, I was an engineering officer. The first part of my career was in construction. I was a project manager for some of the large, heavy civil firms in the industry, Balfour Beatty, Skanska, and then did my stint in the military. Was an engineering officer, did a tour in Afghanistan, building roads and bridges in the mountains. And when I got back, I did use the GI Bill to do an MBA. And while I was doing my MBA, I got very interested in the funding and financial aspects of infrastructure delivery. And so made a career choice at that point to move away from the delivery side of projects and go into the funding and finance of projects. At the same time, while I was doing my MBA, the legislation was changing around crowdfunding, and sites like Kickstarter had been very popular for creators and people to raise money for creative projects through donations. This was back in, following the financial crisis. And so the economy was in the dumps, and the powers that be were looking for ways to jumpstart jobs and businesses and startups. And so there was a discussion around, well, if you can crowdfund donations, why can't you crowdfund equity and investment for businesses, right? And so that got traction in the legislature, and the Obama administration and Congress passed the Jobs Act, which allowed for this, fundamental shift in securities law that allowed for startups to raise equity through online platforms. I had some peers in my MBA program at Berkeley that were quickly taking this idea and applying it to commercial real estate platforms. Fundrise and Realty Shares and CrowdStreet. Yeah. Some of those very early adopters in the commercial real estate space. And my kind of light bulb moment was, if it makes sense for commercial real estate, then it makes even more sense for infrastructure, because if it makes sense to connect retail investment and individual end users with projects that they want to support in commercial real estate, that argument makes even more sense in infrastructure, where you have a public good, a public utility, a public infrastructure project being partially, anyway, financed by people that want to support that project. And then those people that have invested are going to benefit from it. And you've got this very clear alignment of incentives and long-term benefits. And up until that point, the use of private investment in infrastructure had largely been limited to high-profile public-private partnerships, which largely meant large banks, institutional investors, private equity funds. And so your average retail investor did not have access to that. And so that's where the idea of InfraShares came from, crowdfunding equity for infrastructure projects. And, always infrastructure projects need money. There's always funding gaps.
I think what you're getting to is there's the design, bid, build, where you get an asset at the end of the day. And those are probably what we think of as infrastructure, your streets that get the potholes, your water lines. But those are the projects that tax dollars pay for. And what you're talking about is a type of project structure where the financing and the O&M are all part of the delivery. So you're getting that life cycle perspective when you first conceive of the project. And that lends itself to different types of financing. And crowdfunding, equity crowdfunding in particular, is most aligned with that model because there's a revenue stream that incentivizes a developer and equity financing at the beginning of a project.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Exactly. And so that's the critical one, the other critical piece of the story that I didn't mention earlier, but at that same time of the legislation around the Jobs Act was this growing use of this public-private partnership model that you're talking about, where public agencies, because of the lack of public funding to get projects done, started to look at alternative models to deliver projects. And that increased the use of private financing in combination with traditional public funds to wrap together, like you said, the design, the build, the financing, the operations, and the maintenance into kind of a turnkey single delivery, which allows for reduced risk to the public agency and allows for projects to get delivered sooner and allows for a commercial mindset to be brought to the delivery of the projects. And so while that was happening in the Jobs Act, I thought between those two, there was an opportunity to bring in a small slice of community investment, because that private financing that goes into that delivery model is typically large institutional investors. And one of the main arguments against that model, public-private partnerships and design, build, finance, operate, maintain, is those institutional investors are often Spanish construction consortiums, Australian pension funds.
They're not local. They're not the community.
Right. They're not only are they not the community, they're foreign. So the idea, depending on the politics of the area, but the idea of a foreign financial institution owning one of the key roads in your community, or part of the water system in your community, or the telecom system, or part of the school in your community, was a major argument against that delivery model. And so I thought, well, maybe if there's a small tranche of community investment alongside, because with community investment, you're probably never going to be able to replace $1 billion of institutional investment. But if you brought in a small slice, then maybe you could at least give the locals a sense, some transparency, some ownership, some voice in the project to mitigate that argument against that delivery model.
Someone once phrased it to me that equity crowdfunding is the evolution from bonds for infrastructure. And bonds, as we know, are the issuance of debt, financing for individuals to pick up. So I know that Colorado did this. I know that Cambridge has done this, where they've issued mini bonds to sort of debt crowdfund a pool of infrastructure projects. As an individual, I could pay $500, $3,000 to get a bond that has a return of 4 to 6%. Equity crowdfunding is more specific to a project. I don't think I've seen a pool of infrastructure projects yet. And you're looking at returns that are higher because there is a higher risk to equity investment as opposed to debt investment. Can you sort of talk through the projects that are most aligned or best set up to receive equity crowdfunding as part of that capital stack?
Yeah. So any of these large public-private partnerships who are delivered through this alternative DBFOM model are often larger projects that require a lot of capital. And so when those larger projects are packaged, because of the size of the capital, the institutional lenders that are bringing in the debt require the developer to have some skin in the game. And so they require the developer that is in charge of the project to put in some equity. And so the developer equity that's going into the project keeps the developer incentivized to see the project through, to make sure the project is delivered to the highest standards and quality, on schedule and on budget. And it really brings this commercial mindset. What it also brings is a very high cost of capital because it's the equity, because it's very risky, it's very expensive. Those projects that require that developer sponsor equity is where InfraShares can really play a role, because the crowdfunded equity can come in and be part of that sponsor equity tranche and offer an opportunity to the locals to get a piece of that higher return. And so instead of being able to go out and buy a mini bond for low single digit returns, you can have access to an investment in a project in your community that you're going to benefit from with returns that are going to be double digits.
Okay. And those projects have to have some sort of revenue stream.
Correct.
So that could be in the form of an availability payment, so tax dollars that the government set aside for the project. It could be in terms of tolls, user fees. So a lot of these projects, it seems, are toll roads, ports, airports.
So your typical infrastructure project does not generate a revenue stream other than maybe a water system or tolls on a bridge or a toll road, right? So for something like a school or a library or a fire station, what has been done is this use of an availability payment. An availability payment is akin to a lease payment made by the public agency to the developer. It's the long-term revenue stream to the developer that pays back the equity investment and the debt that has gone into the project.
Before we talk about Prince George's County, we can talk about InfraShares.
Yeah.
So I can imagine that individuals might be interested in how do I become part of an equity crowdfunding investment, and who facilitates something like that. And that's where InfraShares sort of steps in. So can you talk about InfraShares' role as a company and how you're typically structured in a P3?
Yeah. So going back to the Jobs Act, when the legislation changed, SEC and FINRA was given the direction to come up with the rules and guidance to facilitate this idea of allowing for online crowdfunding of investment from retail investors. And so SEC said, how can we come up with a way to make sure that these retail investors, have all the information they need to make an informed decision, have a good way to communicate with the people that are trying to raise money, have a good way to sign documents and transfer the money, and have a way to share information with other investors, and a way to track and monitor their investment after they've made an investment. And so they came up with this idea of a funding portal. And a funding portal is what InfraShares is, and it's essentially an objective third-party marketplace where the issuers, the entities that want to raise money, come and post all of their offering information, and then the investors also come and can review all the information, and the funding portal manages that interaction between the two to make sure that all the rules and regulations are met and the investor is not basically taken advantage of by the issuer. And so InfraShares plays that role between the two. We interact with the developer, and because me and my background in infrastructure finance, I'm able to talk the talk with the people in the infrastructure finance space, let them know explain the rules and regulations to them, take their information and their documents, synthesize it into products that meet the SEC requirements, the rules and regulations, acting as a fair, objective third party managing this interaction between a very sophisticated financial institution, basically, and a large crowd of retail investors.
Is this called a broker, or what is the specific term that InfraShares is?
Yeah, called? Good question. So InfraShares, the specific official term is a funding portal.
Okay.
Which is distinct from a broker-dealer. Broker-dealer is a different title that has different requirements and a different certification approval process.
Do you work with a broker dealer through? No.
I do not.
Okay.
No, InfraShares does not. Funding portals do not require a broker dealer in any way.
Okay. And since you're working with the other financing parties for development, who typically engages InfraShares at the beginning? Is it the developer? Is it a public agency that says, oh, we're interested in this? Developer, please bring in an equity crowdfunding funding platform?
Funding portal.
Funding portal.
Yeah.
Please bring in a crowdfunding portal.
Yeah.
And why would that entity reach out to InfraShares?
It's a mix. Sometimes it's a developer saying, we're going after a project. It's a competitive procurement, and we think bringing in a tranche of equity, community equity investment would be a competitive differentiator for us in this procurement. We think the public agency procuring this P3 would really like the idea, and so we want to bring InfraShares into the mix, into the proposal to be a differentiator against the other proposers. On the other hand, sometimes it's the public agency directly who reaches out and says, hey, we've heard about InfraShares. Mm-hmm. We really like this idea. We actually want to build it into the procurement documents. And sometimes it goes that way. And that's how it worked on Prince George's County. They had heard about InfraShares through one of their consultants, and they loved the idea. They had actually heard about it. We had had discussions with them on the first bundle, but because the first bundle was, their kind of first dip into P3, it was kind of something new on top of something new. Mm-hmm. And so once they had success with the first bundle, when they came around for the second bundle, they said, hey, let's go back to this idea of equity crowdfunding, because again, we might have some pushback from, the state, from elected officials mm-hmm. on this project. But if we have community support behind it, mm-hmm. then we're likely to, have an easier time with the political environment.
So you're not really seeing it as a way to bridge a funding gap or a financing gap. You're seeing it as a mechanism to engage the community in a deeper level, yeah. especially on high-profile projects yeah. in which elected officials are looking for community buy-in, yeah. more so than just your typical public yeah. meetings.
Yeah, yeah. So there's largely two use cases for this idea of community investment. The first one is the one you described, where it's a high profile P3, and there's, in terms of institutional investment in infrastructure, there's lots of money sloshing around out there. There's actually no shortage of private institutional investment in good infrastructure P3 deals. Right. And so in those deals, there's not a shortage of investment. There's more than enough money to go around. The problem is it's hard to get those deals done, basically, because of the political environment, the regulatory environment, the community backlash, the small but vocal protests, all of these various issues that, are unique to the United States. And a small tranche of community equity investment can go a long ways to mitigate many, many, many mm-hmm. of those issues that hinder those high-profile P3s. And so, in that sense, yes, it's not a financial. It's not a financial tool to get the deal done. It is largely an optical tool. It's a community engagement tool.
You said there were two ways. So that way is like the community engagement tool. What is the other way that InfraShares and crowdfunding is being used? Yeah.
So the second use case is a small to medium-sized project that has good economics, but is earlier in its stage of development. And while larger, well-developed projects have no problem getting institutional investment, mm-hmm. smaller, early-stage projects do not fit the cookie-cutter requirements for institutional investment. So these smaller, early-stage projects that have good economics often need some early-stage development capital. And those projects because they need this early-stage capital, they need investors who are willing to support a project at the early stages mm-hmm. and take on a higher risk-return profile to get a project going. And if people in the community of the project that's going to serve are willing to invest at that stage, then it can get a project moving forward, de-risk a project to the point where it then can attract institutional capital and move forward.
They're sort of sending this market signal saying the community is interested and investors start paying attention to this project. And we're also going to use this community investment to de-risk the project to a point where institutional investors should come in.
If it were not for the community investment, the project would otherwise not move forward. The community equity investment is critical to actually moving the project forward.
There is an upcoming second phase of a public-private partnership in Prince George's County, which is in Baltimore and Maryland. And the first phase was successful in delivering 6 schools. And the second phase is going to look to deliver more schools. And InfraShares has a small piece of the tranche for community equity investment. Talk us through InfraShares' role in the second phase of Prince George's County Public Schools P3.
Yeah. I'm going to talk pretty high level. So in the second phase, in the second bundle for Prince George's County, there's a development team. That's a consortium of institutional investors and construction firm, engineering firm, operations company, maintenance company, you know, the entire spectrum of you know, the built environment that it takes to deliver a whole bunch of schools. And
Honeywell is part of this.
Right,
This team,
right,
right?
right,
So, like,
right.
you know, even at the maintenance end, there's a
Yep.
partner in the
Yep,
consortium
yep,
that's going to make sure
yep.
this project not only
Yep.
delivered but maintained, right?
Yep. Exactly. So it's a well-rounded, robust team that also includes a minority equity investment partner, and then it includes InfraShares to facilitate this community equity investment program, CEIP. And that was written into the procurement documents. And so this development team went through a procurement process and was selected against 2 or 3 other teams, and based on their proposal was selected. And so the idea is that once the project gets closer to construction, typically the way the financing on these projects works is the equity investment goes in last. So financial close has already happened. It happened last August. The developer has already brought in all of the debt investment, or at least has access to it, and is starting the process of doing all the design and getting the subcontractors on board. And at some point in the near future, we'll start construction. Once they get through a certain phase of construction and have used most of the debt financing, then the equity will go in last. The community equity investment will be part of that equity. So 6 to 9 months before the equity investment is to go in, we will start to ramp up our community equity investment raise. And so the community will see excavators out there and people working. And so it'll be a real project that's going on in their community. They will see boots on the ground and construction happening. They'll be able to visualize the potential impact of their investment in the project. Once we open up the campaign, we'll start marketing it. We'll push out their offering statement. We'll have the platform open for questions and answers, and we'll post webinars talking about the investment. Because we can only raise $5 million a year, the target amount of the community equity investment program is around $8 million, which is 10% of the total equity of the project. So we'll probably have to do it in two tranches. It'll be a major effort to be, you know, marketing to the folks. And so only people in Prince George's County.
Oh, I didn't realize this.
Yes. The Prince George's County Schools is adamant that only people in Prince George's County, and we haven't come to the exact definition of what that means, but only the community will be allowed to invest.
That's incredible.
The project and the investment is going to benefit the community.
Yeah.
And so the returns of this investment need to stay in the community so that the economic impact of this project and this community equity investment program stays in the community, is again not only getting that financial return, but also the social return of all these new schools.
Yeah. That's pretty incredible, especially since the equity is coming in later and the project has mostly been de-risked at that point. So you're saying that this will happen in 2 tranches and 6 to 9 months before the equity is needed for this first tranche, you'll start marketing. What does that look like? I mean, I'm not a big marketing guru, but it seems like that's a pretty legit lift to get everybody in Prince George's County to buy in, understand all the implications of this.
Yeah. Well, what's great, the people in the county are familiar with the model. They're familiar with Prince George's County schools, public schools, obviously as the public agency sponsor. The development team is new, but it's all the brand names in the space. And so really our main challenge is getting the word out about how to access InfraShares. And so Prince George's County has already been very supportive of the program and have already started to set up meetings with the teachers union and various other community organizations. We're going to be on the ground talking to people.
Yeah.
There's plans to have us go in and give financial literacy classes to students so that they can talk to their parents and the parents can share with their parents and that kind of thing.
I am so curious in the space of community engagement and the information ecosystem and misinformation that is going around and the trust or distrust of government. I'm curious, what are some of the tactics that your team is thinking about to make sure that this is as flawless as it can be?
One of the members of the development team is a local PR/marketing firm. And so they are going to work with us to pair us with influencers in the community, in Prince George's County, to give us legitimacy in the community specifically.
I've seen it go awry in both ways, as outsiders coming in, trying to empower the community, but not looking like or being like the community in which you're trying to empower. I'm glad there's a partner that's an expert in that space that's making sure that's possible.
And Kate, I mean, to that point, this is something that a lot of P3s suffer from, that is they come in and they do things like small business participation and apprenticeship programs and stuff like that. But it's always outsiders kind of coming in, and there's very little, it just doesn't translate well.
It seems like tokenism as opposed to like true engagement. Right.
Exactly. And so getting more people from the fabric of the community involved in the project is really key. And there's a number of ways to approach that, but I feel strongly that this is one of them. Getting the people in the community financially invested in the project is one of those ways.
Yeah. And it's also good that stakeholders realize that phase 1 wasn't the right opportunity, but the success of that will help with this equity crowdfunding component for the second round. Because P3s to me in some communities are really receptive, and some communities think of P3s are a dirty word. And so if you're coming into a low information environment that they're not familiar with the model and they see private companies taking advantage of a social infrastructure project like a school, it can already seed distrust. So it's great that the community crowdfunding component has been integrated from the early stages of phase 2 in the procurement process. Hopefully those seeds will lead to a successful offering. It's like a financial stake. The community actually gets a financial stake in the success of their community.
Financial alignment.
Yeah, financial alignment. I love that. So in terms of where you see InfraShares, because this is just one offering, can you talk through the journey of InfraShares and where you see it moving forward and how you're working to engage others in this space?
Yeah. So the journey's been a long one. Morteza Ferragine and I wrote a TRB research paper on this idea back in 2015. I think we wrote it in 2015. We presented it in 2016. And, everybody was like, oh, this is amazing. This is a great idea. We love it. You guys should start a company and do it. And so we started a company, and, of course we thought we were going to be millionaires next year.
Well, it seemed like, especially in that time period, it was an idea that resonated on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
So conservatives loved it because it had this sort of libertarian take. You go choose the infrastructure projects you want to support.
Yeah.
And Democrats and the left side loved it because it was empowering community members to be part of the decision making that's happening in their local communities.
The main hindrance has always been, we're in the infrastructure space, we're in the public agency space. And so the sales cycle is basically 10 years. Mm-hmm. And we heard over and over and over again, this is a brilliant idea. We love it. We want to do it. Let us know when somebody else does it first.
Yeah.
And so we've been in that cycle for the last 7-8 years. And so in that time, we've done other deals. So while we were working on this model, which is really has always been our vision, we've done raises for small startups and
infrastructure startups.
Yeah, which is a whole different flavor and a whole different set of issues and problems. But what doing that did was allow us to test our technology and our process and our legal frameworks and our contracts and just the execution aspects of it. And we did millions of dollars in raises for these infrastructure startups. And so we've gotten to the point where in terms of execution risk on the investment process, we're very confident that that's not an issue anymore. Yeah. And so in that respect, it's good. We've had all that time to, a lot of customer discovery, a lot of research on marketing, and again, just a lot of tinkering with the back end technology. Where we are now is we're just finishing up on basically an entire rebuild of the back end technology.
That's great. And so you're ready for this launch. I'm curious, how do developers and municipalities that are interested in this space and this concept, what do they need to bring to you so that InfraShares is in the best position to help them accomplish what they want? Like, where does the project need to be? What is their purpose and need for having community crowdfunding need to be?
Yeah, so ideally, they're pretty far along in the development process. Ideally, they're, just before procurement, they're starting to put together their procurement documents, and they can look to us for specific language to put into their procurement documents around how to include this community equity investment program.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going. So until next time, let's keep building better cities together.